I think the intention is really for me to talk probably for about half an hour or so, and then to open up the floor, I hope, for questions, etc.
Definitely.
Because I think this is quite a complex topic. And what I'm going to try and do today is to give a very, very brief outline of the topic. So that's my intention. Now, of course, this is not just something which is my opinion, by the way. This is something that I have been researching at PhD level and personally for decades now. And I researched it about my family as well as generally. And so I'm quite happy to be asked about any of those things. And of course, as in any area of history, there will be counter narratives, and this for sure is my narrative. So the African Holocaust is a unique event, historical event, in that it was what I call the foundational genocide, which enabled Euro-American capitalism to flourish. However, in the countries which benefited the most from this, one of the greatest crimes against humanity, and that includes in the UK, one of the countries most implicated in establishing and profiting from the slave trade, this genocide, this exploitation remains barely acknowledged. And so the question that I'm putting forward tonight is, how did this come about, and what are the implications for us today? Now, I'm not going to focus here too much on the United States, and there's reasons why I'm not going to do that. I think we've seen, particularly recently, this focus on what's happening in America with racism, with the state murder of Black people in America. And it almost acts as a smokescreen for this fantasy that people in the UK have, that our problem isn't as bad, that we didn't really play too much of a role, and in any way, the British Navy was absolutely crucial to the emancipation of the slaves. I think it acts as a smokescreen for that, when in fact we can see how in this country all the offshoots of the enslavement and genocide of people of African descent, and that's the racism, the colonialism, impact today on how we live, both as people of colour and as people who might describe themselves as white. And I would point to, for example, our response to refugees, to Brexit, to international policy, let alone what we might see as the evidence of domestic racism and how that impacts on our society. So race runs like a fault line through Euro-American society. Having said I'm not going to focus too much on the United States, I'm going to spend a few minutes looking at the United States, and there's reasons for that. There are historical and material reasons, which means that those fault lines of race and racism and the effects of it are very much more visible and able to be identified than they are in Britain. So to look at the US, first of all, if we think about it, the whole of the United States was formulated at the point and event of genocide and ethnic clearing of the indigenous people. And of course, it was race and the control of the extraordinary wealth that was accumulated on the back of racism. Racism, of course, was developed as a rationale for slavery. Racism is not natural, by the way. There is nothing natural about racism. We are not born as racists. We are taught to be racist, and we're taught to be racist because those who control education and socialization, they profit from those kind of concepts like racism. So racism as a way to rationalize slavery tore the United States, of course, asunder during the Civil War. And now after the so-called emancipation, I mean, I would question how much emancipation there was after the Civil War. There was, in fact, no real healing of that society. And I would ask, how could there be when no process of acknowledgement or reconciliation had taken place? And in fact, what we see again and again is that when genocides have gone on, there's hardly ever been a process of acknowledgement, reconciliation, and recompense. Of course, what happened in America as they cleared the countryside of the indigenous people to settle it for themselves, they did what colonizers, certainly European colonizers, have always done, which is authenticate their actions by claiming authority from their God. It's a well-practiced strategy, and it still runs today. We can all think of examples where we see people being oppressed. We can look in history and see colonizations that have occurred on the basis of some kind of godlike authority that says you can go over and take that land, or that land is your land. I mean, obviously, it's nonsense, although it does seem to be a strategy that still works pretty well today. Now, the engine of American development from the early 17th century, I mean, we're talking about quite early on here, were the profits from cotton. Yes, there was tobacco. Tobacco was pretty major as well, but the really big driver was, in fact, cotton. And it propelled and jet propelled the US into a position of being one of the leading economies in the world. And it did it extremely quickly. So America's first big business, in fact, revolved around slavery. It revolved around injustice and racism. And while it built this extraordinary wealth, the conflict that it then set up for forever, or certainly up to the present day, has just continued, because it hasn't just fractured the divisions between North and South that we saw in the Civil War. It carries on today. And the savagery of the struggle for equality and the oppression in America was breathtaking. And I haven't got time to go into that in detail now. But I'm just going to use some words, and I'm going to read them out here from, and you should look her up. She was an anti-lynching campaigner, a woman called Ida B. Wells, and she was writing in 1909 about lynching. And what she said, remember, this is before the Nazis, by the way, of course. She said, "No other nation, civilized or savage, burns its criminals. Only under the stars and stripes is the human Holocaust possible." So that's 1909. So what do we see? We see then lynchings, we see Segregation almost denotes something kind of quite clean and simple. We've got to remember the brutality of segregation. We've got to think about state-sponsored terrorism within the boundaries of the United States itself, as well as, of course, outside. We've got to think of what replaced lynching, which was, of course, mass incarcerations. There's something like 30–40% of the male Black population has experienced incarceration. And remember, by the way, in America, in most states, if you've had any period of incarceration, you are not entitled to vote. And this was aided even more recently by the so-called war on drugs, by political assassinations, and by other, even cruder forms of voter exclusion. The fight for equal rights didn't go away. So with the emancipation, it fed into and up to that fight for civil rights, and the civil disobedience of the 50s and 60s also fed into other protests, like the protests of the Vietnam War and the state terrorism against the Black Panthers became part of the setting for the most recent insurrections on American streets. And what we see today in Trump is the resurgence of those fracture lines, of those conflicts. This, if you like, the way I see it, is that until and unless the US accepts its responsibility for having benefited from one of the worst crimes against humanity, until it does something to properly redress this, this fracture will continue to break apart and break open. And the systems of oppression and repression will continue to come in to try and repress that. And those systems will impact on everybody. So, how much of this is actually applicable in Britain? Now, of course, there was a genocide of the indigenous people in the Caribbean, although very conveniently, it was mostly done by the Spanish. But British culpability in and responsibility for the kidnap and transportation of Africans, for undermining African development, for acts of genocide in Africa is clear and well documented. Africans were brought to the Caribbean, to the Americas, to Europe by British ships in their almost unaccountable millions. And British banking, shipping, insurance became world leaders on the back of that trade. It funded and enabled the Industrial Revolution, which enabled Britain to become a world leader. It was essential to the cultural, philosophical, and scientific revolutions of the 18th century. And of course, in terms of the aristocracy, it gave them, and the ruling class, it gave them a huge boost in assets, which then, of course, fed into the way that they were able to control social systems and politics at home. I know I'm already hearing some people saying, you know, yeah, but, you know, Africans also sold Africans. Now, this is a really complicated narrative, and I haven't got time to deal in full with that issue. I also think it's really interesting to see the way that is always sort of clung on to when we talk about the slave trade. And it's also done really in such a simplistic way. And one wonders why that same question about complicity is not raised with other genocides, but just with the African genocides. I think my answer to that is that we really do need to look whenever you're looking at issues of complicity as to where the power lies and who has most to gain from whatever the action is. For example, what I know about it is that in the records that show you the balance of power and what was going on, you know, I've traveled in Africa, I've traveled in the Caribbean, I've been looking at these records in Britain as well as in the Caribbean and elsewhere. Some records have been suppressed and others, I believe, have been quite purposefully destroyed. Now, I'll give you one very short example for that. At the time, I was doing some work which was published about the links between the great houses in Britain and the plantation houses in the Caribbean. I found it very interesting that recently this came up in terms of the National Trust. It's like suddenly people have actually realized, wow, our great houses, all our aristocratic families bolstered their wealth and power on the backs of slavery. So I was looking in particular on a family called the Drax family. The Drax family are very interesting because they went to the Caribbean initially as quite, poor people. In fact, I think they arrived initially as indentured slaves, but managed to, through becoming overseers and then investing in slavery, they managed to gather wealth. They then, and this is their importance within Caribbean history, is that they made contacts with the Portuguese merchants who understood and had the expertise of refining sugar. They'd already been doing that elsewhere, and they brought that to Barbados. If you go to Barbados today, you can see you're not allowed inside it. It's one of the oldest plantation houses. It's Jacobean, and it's still there now, and it's still owned by the Drax family. The Drax family is now the Lord Lieutenant of Dorset. So that's the person who represents the Queen in Dorset. They're immensely wealthy. At the time when I was doing my research, I contacted the Drax family and asked if I could have a look. And shall we say, they were very, very firm that they didn't want this history to be resurrected. Now, for Marxists, there is an important, this is an important part of history, because what I would suggest, and many others have too, is that actually the people who were taken from Africa to work on these great estates in the Caribbean were actually the first, what we would call, modern people. What's really interesting about them is that they were in fact the very first people to live under systems of industrialization. And it was what those wealthy landowners learnt in the Caribbean about industrialization that they brought over, not just to their agricultural estates in this country, but the systems they brought over from there fed into the Industrial Revolution, both socially and economically. Now, we know, if we think about it, we know what this means to be a modern person. What it means is that you have a loosened connection to the land, that your life is no longer governed by the seasons, it's governed by the clock, it's governed by so many hours of work. You are not the master of your own work. Writers like Thomas Hardy have talked about the impact of industrialization, not just to the landscape, but to people. Writers like William Blake painted about it and wrote poetry about the satanic mills. And this was the story about the intense alienation of people under the Industrial Revolution. And this was what the people who were taken from Africa to work on the Caribbean plantations, this is what they experienced in the most intense way possible. And the results, like I say, are with us, not just in terms of the kind of societies we live now, but this, if you like, intense extraction of wealth, of agricultural wealth, of raw materials, if you think about it at its most extreme, is what's ended up in what I'm sure is going to be the most major crisis we're going to be facing, which is global warming. Now, the reason why many Marxists have seen Blacks to be the people who would be at the vanguard of any revolution is because they have experienced this alienation from the longest. They experienced the ultimate commodification there could be, when your actual body becomes a site of commodification. Something, it's not just your labor which is bought and sold, it's your body. And and for women, the produce of your body, i.e. your children, that are bought and sold. There is nothing of you that is not open to financial exploitation. I would suggest that it is this kind of, if you like, latent knowledge that, if you like, people from the African diaspora have this knowledge about what capitalism is about, that I think is the fear that has been expressed by the establishment over the recent Black Lives Matter movement. Because for many Black people, you know, you don't need to tell us that this system is corrupt. You don't need to tell us that the media lies. You don't need to tell us about the way that the oppressed are treated, because it has been going on in such a blatant way for hundreds of years. I'm just going to turn now for a minute and look at something, if you like, about the effects that this has had on the Caribbean community and the descendants of the slaves in itself. Because if you think about it, for Caribbean people, they came into existence totally as a result of this genocide. Something like 95, 98% of certainly of people from Jamaica have some European heritage. The bond between the peoples of Africa and the people of Europe, and that history is embedded in our DNA. There is our history as Africans was not just denied, it was taken away. The language was forbidden. Any customs were forbidden. Family units were forbidden. We were actually not in any way allowed to count our existence as being of any value apart from what it merited in terms of British society. And what has that led to? Well, if you want to talk about what happens with alienation, I would suggest to you that is one of the reasons that if you look at health outcomes in the UK, people of Afro-Caribbean descent has one of the lowest health outcomes, one of the highest incidents of mental health problems. we die earlier, we work in the lowest paid jobs, we have the worst housing, we are underrepresented politically, including in the Labour Party, and for goodness sake, of course, we see how black MPs in the Labour Party are hounded. I mean, you know, after Diane Abbott appeared last night on Newsnight talking about Keir Starmer, the venom against her was extraordinary. I find it, to me, quite shocking that the official level of the Labour Party remains so silent about the position of its black female MPs. So what do we do about this, and where do we go with this? How can it stop? How can it change? Well, I think, like I say, that Black Lives Matter has really acted as a very timely reminder of where we have to go and where we might end up if we don't. Race is that fault line. It's a gaping wound, and it cannot and will not heal until the questions that have been raised are addressed and resolved. And those issues of justice and equity are not just important for people of colour, they're important for all of the people who are not treated equitably in our society. Because, you know, as we know, none of us can actually be free until we are all free. We are tied into this relationship. We have an identity which is British and yet not quite. We contribute hugely to British society. I mean, just think about, I mean, you know, the clothes you wear, the music that is played, fashion, the influence in art, the influence in terms of political thought, in terms of...
Sorry, Jackie, there's something on your microphone, I think some paper.
Oh, sorry.
No worries, thank you.
Yeah, and yet it remains unacknowledged. It is time for that to be faced, and it is time for us to be pressing our leadership to be actually considering why this is not at the top of the agenda of a party which claims to be the party of equality. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Lots of interesting subjects raised. Comrades, if you have a question or would like to make a contribution, please click the raise hand button. I'm going to kick things off. I did like your point that children are not racist, which is when you have children, it becomes very clear to you and very obvious that children are actually colorblind. They're being born colorblind, they grow up colorblind with their friends, etc. And something changes, something is socialized, and it becomes something different, which has been very interesting to me as a recent first-time mother, how that's being made and how problems are being raised or made into your children. I did we should have probably said this at the beginning. Obviously, we're not denying the Nazi Holocaust, which has been something I've been charged with again today for addressing this issue here today and for calling the African Holocaust a Holocaust. Though I would recommend comrades have a look at Norman Finkelstein's book on the Holocaust industry, which is a fascinating look at how the state of Israel has made industrialized the Holocaust in that sense and made it into an industry for their own purpose. It's a fascinating book. Did you say that if the first mention of the Holocaust that you found was 1908? Did I get that right?
Yeah, 1909. The first time it was used in terms that I have been able to find in a way that talks about the way that people are treated was by Ida B. Wells, who was this anti-lynching campaigner, and she was talking about, you know, because people think lynchings were just lynchings. In actual fact, what used to happen very, very often, in fact, most frequently, was that either before death or after death, the bodies of these people would be burned. It was part of, if you like, the ritual burning. It went with the lynchings, and she termed this the American, you know, this is an American Holocaust, a burnt offering, which is actually not addressed. But I think I want to be very clear that I don't really want to be diverted into this issue about the Holocaust or talking about what happened to the Nazis, because actually, I actually think that the issue is about the lack of awareness about the African Holocaust. I think the awareness of what happened in the Nazis, I'm not saying that it hasn't got more to go, but I think it's pretty high up there. And if you look at the curriculum, it's pretty high up there too. But yeah, Ida B. Wells, have a look at what she said.
Thank you. Yes, no, I only mentioned it because, as I said, a couple of hours ago, I was charged with it, which is quite incredible to me. Tony, hello. You're muted, Tony.
Okay, sorry, I came in late, so I've only caught glimpses of what you said, Jackie, and you'll probably reprimand me for everything I do say, not least about the Holocaust. But it's quite interesting, really, because of the way that the Holocaust is used and the way that it is weaponized. Because for a start, I mean, let's look at it. I mean, there must be hundreds, if not thousands, of books on the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews. And yet I think there is one book, maybe two, on the 10 million Africans who died in the Belgian Congo. And that in itself should suggest to you something, that it's not about the atrocities, however horrific they were, but the way that the memory of those who died is politicized, and how Zionism and Israel has politicized it. I know Owen Jones, in his recent book, I've been told he's written a horrific chapter on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And he says that Jews suffer a collective trauma, which presumably explains everything Israel does, that when you're under a trauma, you can be as racist and nasty and vicious as you want, and it's excusable. But no doubt if you were to claim that you were a victim of collective trauma, then that would be disregarded immediately. So it's a selective trauma. But I think the point that really needs to make is the way that memory is used, because that is really important. The way the Zionists use it is not to say that we should be opposed to militarism, to racism, to ethnic cleansing, to the way that we treat the other, but in order to justify what happens, and that is incredibly important. There's a very good article about a year ago by Gideon Levy, who was talking about the thousands of Israeli students, high school students, who go each year to Auschwitz, covered in nationalist symbols, the Israeli flag. And he says, if only one of them, when they came back, went to the Gaza fence and said, this must not happen again. But on the contrary, it's because of Auschwitz that it can and it should happen again in Israeli eyes. And so that is really important. If we can't learn the lessons of the past, or if the ruling class adopts those memories and perverts them in order to carry on where it has before, then what point is there having such a memory? Which is why Yehuda Alkner, who was the rector of the Central European University, who was himself a survivor of the Holocaust, said he wrote a famous article for which he was pilloried in Haaretz about 20 years ago, when he talked about the need to forget. He said, basically, remembering these things and the way they are used is causing more damage than good, and therefore we should forget about it entirely. I don't agree with that, but I can certainly understand how it is. And that is the way that the ruling class, and it's not just the Zionists, it's how the Western ruling class has adopted the Holocaust almost as a badge of morality. I mean, you look at it, they have the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which, you know, in itself is weaponizing the Holocaust. But do they want to speak out about the fact that European countries have now criminalized people who go out to rescue refugees in the Mediterranean? You know, the absurdity. You can serve 20 years in prison in Italy because you've actually saved people from drowning in the waters of the Mediterranean. That is what we have to do and what we have to point out. So,
I'm going to say this again. I do not want this to turn into this.
no, I've finished. Don't worry.
But there is quite rightfully an insistence that we do not rank one genocide higher than the other. It's an impossibility. How can you say that what happened in the Belgian Congo is worse than what happened in Rwanda, than what happened to the indigenous people in Southern America? And yet, at the same time as that happens, we're also told that certain words and certain terms have to be preserved for the Nazi Holocaust. Now, type it in and you will see that in America, African Americans talk about the African Holocaust readily. And I will term the Holocaust that didn't just affect my ancestors, but affects me and my relatives and friends now. I will call it what I choose to call it. And if you want to know about collective trauma, then just consider what it feels like as a Black person to watch on the television night after night the murdering of people by state forces, and to have that discussed as if that doesn't matter. Have a look at the mental health figures for people of African descent in this country, and then talk to me about trauma and about racial trauma. You know, I know about historical trauma, and so does every single person of Caribbean descent in this country.
No, I agree. I mean, do you want me to come back or all?
Somebody else to come on now, Tony.
Sorry, Mike, please.
Yeah, Tony briefly talked about this, but of course, Jackie's introduction talked about the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. But of course, at the same time, in fact, a little bit later because of the colonization process, this process was going on in Africa itself. I mean, we talked about the Belgian Congo as being possibly the most vicious and blatant example of it. But the whole of capitalist, well, certainly Western capitalist development is predicated on the exploitation of African natural resources using the other African natural resource, which is the bodies of African people to extract those resources.
And it continues today. It's
Sorry?
not. And it continues today.
And it yes, absolutely.
It's not as if, I mean, this is what strikes me as extraordinary. Here we have a historical, unprecedented event in the African Holocaust. And it is the effects of which are ongoing today, in particular in America and in Britain, but also across the African continent. And yet we're supposed to pretend as if it's all finished and it was history and it's a done deal. It isn't, and it won't be, and it continues.
Yeah.
And it will erupt and it will cause issues. And you know, one thing I will say, one of the reasons I think why the Chinese will be so effective in Africa is that they weren't the colonizers. You know, that is one reason. And there is a kind of karma, if you like. There's a karmic value to what happened in Africa and what happened in the Caribbean. And you cannot escape this history. You cannot brush it under the carpet as if it doesn't matter. It does. We are part of your history. We are part of what made you.
That's why we're discussing it. Mike, did you want to, were you
Yeah,
finished?
yeah. The actual physical exploitation of human bodies may not be quite as blatant in most cases, but if you look at the wars that occur in Africa, they're nearly all promoted either directly by Western capitalist agencies, either the companies or the intelligence agencies themselves, or their African puppets. So yeah, I mean, it's as Jackie said, it's ongoing. It's ongoing.
I'm going to bring in a couple of other comrades now. Jenny, please, the next one. You're muted still.
Hi, I just want to make a couple of sort of on the ground points. I'm no longer, but I was married to a Tanzanian and I lived in Tanzania for some time. And when we came back to the UK, there was an organisation called the Tanzania Britain Group or something. It was like a friendship group. And a group of Caribbean people in Birmingham, this was a Black History Group, came and gave a little talk about African history. And I was sitting with a group of Tanzanians at the time. And so they were talking about things like, for instance, how Europeans didn't settle in West Africa, but did in East Africa, that prior to what everybody thinks, you know, all the sort of very general stuff about, you know, there were highly developed and politicized communities and civilizations in Africa and stuff like that. And there were a lot of non-Tanzanians at the meeting, and we're expressing, but Caribbeans, and we're expressing amazement at some of the stuff that the Black History Group were sharing. And the Tanzanians started muttering amongst themselves, you know, what's all this about? What do you mean you didn't know about it? How come you didn't know about it? How come you didn't know about this stuff about African history? And in the car on the way back, I said, you know, what was all that about? And they said they couldn't understand it. There are libraries all over the place. Everybody gets to go to school, and there are books, and it's freely available. Why doesn't the Black community in England know about African history? And it was about trying to explain why that is, because it's been written out of any curriculum, and it's not talked about. And that's why, but they found it astounding that people didn't know as much as they should know as Caribbean people about Black African history. The other thing I'd say is that having visited both West Africa and East Africa, it's really amazing to see the difference, talking about the continued sort of like neo-colonialism. In West Africa, Europeans, they raped and pillaged, if you like, but they didn't settle because the climate was not conducive for them. Whereas in East Africa, they actually moved out there and settled, and that had an impact on cultures across West and East Africa. In that, in West Africa, in the countries I visited there, African history is precious and explored and advanced in such a way, in a positive way. For instance, in Ghana, they have a phrase that's called Sankoma, which is a bird looking backwards. And the idea is you take the best from the past in order to use it for the future. And it was very much praised and promoted. Whereas in East Africa, when I lived in Tanzania, but I've also visited Kenya, what was praised and lauded, if you like, was bits of Western culture, you know, or the North culture, white culture coming in. So instead of, for instance, using traditional medicines that were very effective, as you would do in West Africa, the idea is you use a pill in East Africa, and people like the Maasai and herbal, the market women selling herbal medicine, that's considered primitive and or just primitive. And it's that thought of mind, if you like, about the way people see African cultures. And then just finally, another point about the use of the word Holocaust, the Holocaust as in the Holocaust with respect to Jewish people. And we've talked about the African Holocaust. I remember reading a book by Paul Preston, I live in Spain, about the Spanish Holocaust. And I don't have a problem actually using the word Holocaust as long as it's prefixed with what sort of Holocaust, whereas I see the Holocaust as something that relates to the Jewish experience. But to talk of the African Holocaust, I don't have a problem with, or the Spanish Holocaust. And I just don't think it's a problem.
Can I just say, I think there's something, you know, that you brought up I'd like to respond to, which is there is a reason that Black people in this country and Caribbean people do not know anything about African history. And it's not just that it's not available. What you've got to understand is that in the Caribbean, we were taught our history was English history.
Mm.
And so anything that was African history was A, of no interest to us,
Yes,
and B, was inferior. So
exactly.
what many Caribbean people did was internalize
Exactly.
racism.
Yeah.
And I think this self-hatred and the battle against this self-hatred, if you like, is part of a trauma that very few people have had to kind of cope with in that way. And when you are then living in what is supposed to be your mother country, and that's what my mother called it when we came to this country in 1959, she was returning to a mother country that she had never even been to. So think about the psychology of somebody who returns to what they call a mother country that they have never been to, when the mother country rejects you as the other. You have no place to be. This is a depth of alienation which is just so profound, and only a very few people have done real work on this.
Thank you, Jackie. Yes, I also agree with Jenny. There's other Holocausts. Somebody mentioned the Irish Holocaust conducted by the English. It's also something we shouldn't forget about. Steve Freeman, please.
Hi, Jackie. That was I really enjoyed that. It was very interesting and some good points. So I've got a comment to build on what you were saying, or add to what you were saying, or reinforce it. And then I've got a kind of question as well. So the first one was, I like what you were saying about thinking of this as being, in effect, the world's first working class. I think that's what I got out of the first part of it. And that's quite interesting.
Industrialized working class.
Sorry?
The world's first industrialized
working class, absolutely. And so what's kind of, and that was an angle I hadn't particularly thought of, but there is an idea I think goes around that sort of slavery is something from the ancient world, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Egyptians. It's like an old thing that we just sort of hung on to for a bit, as opposed to the way you put it was it's the beginning of the modern world. It's not the continuation of the ancient world.
Exactly.
Uncivilization, whereas it's actually the start of where we are.
And this is such an absolutely critical point. And people do this all the time. They say this thing, which is slavery's always gone on. There's always been slavery.
Yes.
And it's so mistaken. That's like saying marriage has always gone on. There's always been marriage. There are probably 100 different kinds of marriage. Both historically, you know, there are marriages with one woman and many men. There are open marriages. There are temporary marriages, and so too for different forms of slavery. And I'll give you this as just an example. In Rome, you could be a slave, you could get your freedom, and then you could become a citizen of the empire with the same rights and privileges as any other citizen. And in fact, there was no color racism in the Roman Empire. What we have in the plantation system is what you would call chattel slavery, not feudal slavery. Feudal slavery, again, is something very different. So, for example, if you want to take the Asante of Africa, who had slaves and who actually allowed some of their slaves to then be sold on to Europeans, what they understood as slavery was very different to chattel slavery. Slaves were part of the family household. They were part of the clan group. As you know, there is this thing, if you look up in America, in terms of the Constitution, Black people were seen as being 3/5 of a man. So the whole center of this kind of racism is that slaves were not human. They were subhuman. They weren't human. And actually, the least trace of Black blood in you would put you in the subhuman category. Now, the only people I can think of who saw race in that way that comes to mind, of course, are the Nazis, who, you know, you could go back, and if you had a trace of Jewish blood going back 3 generations, 4 generations, you were still thought to be Jewish. So chattel slavery is a very, very different kind of slavery than the slavery that was practiced by the Vikings or by the Romans or by anybody else.
Can I just add to that point to say that one of the things that made it different is the Industrial Revolution itself. If you were going to mass produce cotton for the factories and you were going to mass produce sugar, then you needed the exploitation, or a different kind of exploitation to the other kinds of slavery that existed before, because it both powered and was powered by the Industrial Revolution to extract the maximum amount of sugar and cotton and things like that. So it was driven by the profit motive in a way that these other types of slavery
That's the whole point of it. It was the first really industrialized system. When I went onto a plantation in the southern states of America, we went to this plantation, and it had been owned by this woman. And she had worked out the minimum you could feed somebody and the maximum years you needed to keep a slave alive to give you the maximum profit. Yes. And that time was 7 years. Yes. Now, no Roman would have done that as a calculation for his slaves or her slaves. Yes. That didn't occur. This is why the project of capitalism and of plantation African slavery is so intimately combined.
Right, and just to add my second kind of, my other bit was the question. I know it's going along now, but I was going to ask you about, in terms of this being a class issue, to think of it in class terms as well as in race terms. Now, in other words, the question would be, were there any classes in Africa? Was there African classes involved in this? Now, the reason I say that, because the problem is if you start bringing Black people into this, people say it's a kind of white excuse. We're just trying to spread the blame around a little bit. But really, if it's a class, if there are African classes, for one thing, it means there must be a civilization in Africa for a starter, for there to be classes. So you're going into a whole other historical thing there. But what class forces in Africa, because it was a class issue of one class exploiting another class, or creating another class, if you like, then the class forces in Africa is also part of the story as a class story rather than just a race story. No.
Well, you're now talking about something really deeply complicated. One thing I would say to you is I don't see the foundation of class as being a definition of civilization. In fact, I would say the opposite. I think the nomadic cultures who have no class are the most sophisticated.
I agree with that.
But I also would say there were different levels of society. I don't think you could, how much you could then apply a Marxist analysis of class to that, I think is really difficult to say. But can I just say one more thing about class, which you haven't asked, but your question has sort of drawn out of me. Something which C.L.R. James, and you know, if you're interested in a Marxist interpretation about how race works, please read some C.L.R. James. Absolutely crucial, because what he would suggest is that the thing about color is that it's a way of marking your class. It's, if you like, an inherited mark of class. And I think that in itself tells you something as well about the interaction between class and race. And I believe that this was actually recognized by many people in the working class in the 18th and 19th century. And that is why you saw at times such a bond between the cotton workers and the fight for emancipation. This is why you saw, with the struggle against the sugar trade and the boycott, you know, the first boycott ever in the whole world was against sugar. I mean, I find it extraordinary now, having been expelled in part because of what I said about BDS, because they don't tell you that bit, because of course that doesn't suit them very much, that actually the first boycott movement was against sugar, and that was supported, run mostly by women and supported by the working class. And I think that tells you something about, and you know, if you want to look more about that, have a look at people like Cuffey and the you know, William Cuffey and the kind of role that they took on. I think the English working class understood the comparison between what was happening with them and what was happening over there. And they were willing, and this is what happened in the cotton mills, they actually actually did without money. They had their wages stopped because they were supporting the boycott of slave-grown cotton. Now, if you think how poor people were, you're talking about the 19th century here, then you can see the strength of feeling that was going on. And all of that history, that what I'm always amazed about with socialists in this country is that that part of socialist history is so unknown. It's not something we know. And yet it should be something that's at the heart of our practice today.
I'm really enjoying this, and I know it's a bit of a back and forth with some speakers, but I think it works quite well. And I think we're getting into a subject which is really interesting, is race and class. And I do have a question on this for you. When you, in your introduction, actually, I don't think you said the slaves were the first working class. You called them the first people of the industrialization and, you know, exploited, etc. And I think that's actually an important issue, because working class, in the sense of the Marxist analysis, means you sell your labor power, isn't it? It's you can sell your labor power, you're not exploited, etc. And you're also, that makes you the architect, not just of your own potential your own liberation as a class, but also human liberation as a total. Which of course slaves were, as a slave, you know, caste class, I don't know how you would want to phrase it, was actually, the exploitation of slaves wasn't very industrially clever in that sense. I don't think it was very in terms of, obviously they used them and they were able to exploit them, but in terms of capitalism and mass production, etc., I think you need a lot of input to keep slaves alive, don't you? You need you can't quite exploit them as well, perhaps, as the working class, who has to sell the labor cost. Maybe it's the other way around. Just a second on that. But from a capitalist point of view, you know, you can't just replace slaves that easily. You can't, you know, you have to keep them alive. There's the reproduction issue, etc. I mean, there is a reason, I think, as well, why capitalism moved away from it But it's a subject I don't know very much about, but I'd like to hear you more talk more about that.
Well,
either now or later, up to you.
I don't quite agree with you on that. I think actually, certainly for quite a period, the slave trade was very, very profitable. And why it was profitable was not only could you extract extraordinary labor from these people under the worst of conditions, but you could trade their bodies, and that would also give you a profit. And you actually had the profit from their childbearing as well. Now, that is a complex issue, because actually what then happened is that forms of resistance started to become developed, certainly in Jamaica, much more, for example, than in America. Although Toni Morrison writes about this in her book, Beloved, where women purposefully and with love killed their children. And they killed their children as an act of resistance against their slave masters. And they killed their children because what they didn't want is for their children to go through what they had gone through. So what happened actually was, for many reasons, not just for those reasons, it became less and less profitable. The reason the British got out of slavery was not because Wilberforce and the bishops stood up in Parliament. Right. I mean, forget that. It was because the slaves were revolting. Number one, the slaves were revolting. The profits from the slave trade was coming down, and the profits from the sugar trade were coming down. And actually, what they instituted, what they instituted in the Caribbean, is the story in America is slightly different. But what they instituted was a kind of, if you like, a set of sort of apprenticeships where Black people had, in many ways, a lot of the worst things about being slaves without any of the protections. And of course, what happened, and it was to the point of billions of pounds, remember, is that the white slave owners were compensated, not the slaves. White slave owners, I think I heard it was to the tune of something like 17 billion pounds. 17 billion pounds of compensation. Of course, the difference in America was there was an agreement in emancipation that you would get, I can't remember what it was, half an acre and a donkey or something when you were emancipated. And that's why one of the campaigns in America is based on that, because actually that promise was never fulfilled. It was, and there has never, ever been compensation. Never, ever been compensation. It's really interesting. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, how many genocides have we actually ever seen where proper recompense has in any way been paid? And it's really not very many. I mean, even in South Africa, what you got was the Truth and Resolution Committee, which was actually Black people listening to white people saying, we're sorry about this, and accepting it. Great. But where was the recompense? And the issue of recompense is a difficult one. It's a complicated one. But I think what we see in terms of capitalism is capitalism will always make sure that the powerful elite will profit, whether it's because people are slaves or because people are emancipated.
Very important point. I think the lack of profitability led to the end of slavery. Very important point. Andy Wynn, please, you've been waiting a while to come in. And then Norman.
Thank you very much. There we are. Thank you very much. And thank you, especially Jackie, for, as usual, a wonderful talk. I just wanted to make a couple of points. One was on the scale of the African genocide. If you look at the population of Africa, it basically didn't grow for 200 years between 1650 and 1850. And as a result, the African people as a proportion of the global population went from roughly 20% to less than 10%. So slavery had a huge impact right across the whole of Africa. The other point is, bringing it more up to date, is that the idea that I would say that the British state cooperates with the exploitation of working class Africans. And one example we've got going on at the moment is an uprising in Nigeria, which is by far the biggest country in Africa in terms of population. There's been an uprising for the last 2 weeks against police violence, harassment and intimidation. And with huge protests in all the major cities across the country, and a degree of violence in terms of retaliation, both in terms of police shooting, and there's apparently shooting going on in Lagos, the biggest city in Nigeria, as we speak this evening, and also through paid thugs. But we've got the intervention of Britain. So Britain, through DFID, provides aid to Nigeria and to the Nigerian police. So they train the Nigerian police, and British aid increased 13 times between 2001 and 2016. So we've got very significant British aid and direct aid to the Nigerian police. And I mean, one specific example of how far this goes in terms of the British state ignoring the violence of the police in Nigeria or the armed forces in Nigeria is that a couple of years ago, 39 people were gunned down one Monday afternoon, but that happened to be Shiite demonstrators. 1 week later, Prince Charles still went ahead with an official visit to Nigeria. Yeah. So gunning down 39 Nigerians didn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's very important that, you know, what the British ruling class, the British state did in terms of the African Holocaust is continuing.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I just also add to your point of what you said in terms of the destruction that was wreaked in terms of the potential for development in Africa. It was even worse, because when people think of the people who were taken from the slave trade, they just think people were taken. No, it wasn't a general cross-section of the population who were taken. It was mostly men, not women. And it was mostly between the age of about 16 and 25. And there is some evidence that about half of that population was taken. So what you're talking about is the decimation of a whole generation of people. And, you know, they didn't want people landing to work on the plantations who were camel herders. What good was that? They were looking for very specific skills. When slave trade was established in Africa, if you look at what was happening in West Africa at the time, technologically, there was very little difference between the technologies of Europe and the technologies of Africa. Very little difference. And the gap that opened up happened after that point, after the point when the slave trade started to burgeon.
Thank you. Norman, please. You're muted still.
Oh, got it. Yeah. Hi, Jackie. But just in listening to you and listening to Jackie, giving us a fascinating and superb analysis of the situation with regard to people of African origin, Black people. It just struck me what an active, amazing genius it was for the Labour Party to expel Jackie Walker, because it made clear to anyone who hadn't guessed it by now that the Labour Party is absolutely not a party that wants to change things, but it's a party of the establishment that wants to keep the establishment as it is. And anyone who suggests the sorts of things that you're suggesting about cries out for radical change, a huge social change, not just a kind of an amelioration of the effects of racism, but something much more structural to society, because it says that our society is built on the exploitation of Black people, and over a historic period, and blow me down, they're still exploiting them now. So the descendants of those people who allowed us to build an empire are still here, still doing the worst jobs and still helping to create wealth for the people of this country. It's just astounding. So I would disagree with Jackie when she talks about you can't brush this under the carpet, because Britain seems to have been incredibly adept at brushing this under the carpet for a very long time. Because in Britain, the general concept is that this problem of racism, racism against Black people, is either an American problem, or it's a problem of the past in Britain. It's something that the British solved because we abolished slavery according to the accepted kind of mythology. And the problem is, obviously, the exploitation is still here and the racism is still here. I come from Thanet, and we have the most appalling acts of racism that go on all the time. And people, it's built into the way of life. We're having a meeting tomorrow about the racism in Thanet, which we're having somebody testifying to the amount of racism that goes on a day-to-day basis. And we have a Tory MP here who has said publicly that he doesn't think there's any racism in Thanet or any significant amount at all, and that nobody's ever reported it to him. So the denial of it all, the ignoring of it all is still going on. And even amongst the people who aren't, I mean, he's obviously a Tory MP and he's an ex-UKIPer and all the rest of it. But even amongst the people who aren't, right-wing inclined, there's a kind of an ignoring of the problem, which is, probably just as bad. It's as bad to ignore a problem as it is to be part of it in a way. I mean, it's because it's part of the problem is to ignore it. So we're facing that in a terrible way. But this is my question really, which is, one of the things that our Tory MP ignored was the Black Lives Matter movement. We had 2 marches, huge marches in Thanet, and he's pretended they didn't happen. It's brought to his attention. He just ignores it. Huge marches. But how do we harness the energy of those people, the enthusiasm of those people to do something important about the situation that we're in? Because that's the problem. I mean, we're trying to make contact with the Black Lives Matter people locally, and they're telling us they don't want to get involved in politics. So this isn't a very good sign for trying to change things. How do we get that energy harnessed to make real change in our society and get to a situation where people can't brush it under the carpet anymore, can't ignore it? And that's the question that I'm struggling with, and I'd like any help I can get with it. Thank you.
Norman, I stand corrected. Can I just say that my experience of being in the Labour Party, there have been 3 high points for me of racism in this country. One was when I arrived in this country and my experience of being a child in this country. The second point was when I went and lived in Dorset and went into which was 30 years ago, and went into like an innocent, went into the white countryside. My third worst experience was being a member of the Labour Party. And I'm not just talking, by the way, this is not simply a reference to what happened in terms of the witch hunt. As Norman knows, the response to me was firm and, to me, obviously racist at many points within the Labour Party. The racism within the Labour Party, the structural, undeniable racism of the Labour Party, the evidential racism of the Labour Party, which was repeated in the which was affirmed in the Chakrabarty report, which is affirmed every time you look at the numbers of people of colour who get to stand for office, which is affirmed by the way that in particular, our Black women MPs are treated, not just by the awful people out there outside the party, but inside the party. Look at what happened with Jess Phillips. Look at how much abuse Diane Abbott, Dawn Butler have to take, with barely a word coming from the leadership. In fact, the leadership telling us that the actual problem of race within the party is with Jews. Not apparently, there's no problem of racism in the party with people of colour. I mean, Starmer, actually, one thing he's managed to do is alienate more Black people than I have ever known. And this leads into my other point. I'm not surprised, actually, that people in Black Lives Matter are looking at politics and politicians and saying, I don't want to go near you. The hypocrisy of Starmer and Rayner taking that knee made me want to vomit. It actually made me so angry. The hypocrisy of him having Ruth Smith brought out as an example of this is what the Labour Party should be after what had happened with Mark Wadsworth is something that the Labour movement, I think, historically will become deeply ashamed of. I think there is no way that you're going to get Black Lives Matter people involved in a political scene. And I think perhaps, and I wouldn't have said this, by the way, before the last 10 years. I think sometimes Black people need to organize for and with themselves, because my experience of working in a mostly an overwhelmingly white left is not a positive one. It is not a positive one. And I have met so many other Black people who are at a point of burnout and anguish that I'm not sure that I would recommend to any Black person that they either join the Labour Party or would support the Keir Starmer. I mean, how can you support this person? How can you support him with his response to Black Lives Matter, with his response to the leaked report? You know, a report we can't even, apparently, you lot in the Labour Party, you're not even allowed to talk about it, Norman, are you? I mean, maybe we should have a hand signal for it. I mean, this is the depths that the Labour Party has got to. And I despair. But I think what Black Lives Matter needs to do is to be now exerting pressure from the outside of the party politics. And actually, you know, I'm not sure it's the point, is what I'm saying. I don't think at this point is a suitable point for Black Lives Matter to be entering into the Labour Party. But I think it's nonsense. Anybody who says they don't want to be political, that's ridiculous. They obviously don't understand what politics means. Black Lives Matter is political. It is political.
Just a quick word there. I mean, this is organized by the Labour Left Alliance. We do encourage comrades to stay in the Labour Party. I know it's a struggle, but...
I didn't say they shouldn't stay.
Say again?
I didn't say they shouldn't stay.
No, I know. Some people have taken your comments as to mean that they should leave, but I don't think we should do them the favor. The Labour Party is a party where the class struggle has been fought at its highest level in Britain and perhaps even internationally over the last 5 years. So it's shown how important it is that the left stays involved and fights back if it's allowed to. I mean, Jackie isn't, lots of other people here in the audience have been expelled and suspended, but we would urge comrades not to leave by themselves. I'm also, obviously, I'm an internationalist, I'm a anti-racist. I hope that, Black and white and Asian and we all do fight together and not separately. I know where Jackie is coming from, and I've not had the experiences you've had, but it is a danger if our class divides itself. But I know you know that as well. Okay, Matthew, quickly. And I do have to ask comrades to keep it a little bit short if they can. Hello,
yeah, sorry, obviously coming in at the last. I think the points have been raised so far are really good, and I've really enjoyed this session. I do think, though, that just to draw out in Marxist terms, there is a clear difference between slavery and capital in terms and capitalism as a means of control of a workforce. I mean, clearly, if you see this, to take it technically, I mean, obviously there is a difference in terms of, both in terms of the methods of control, which is pure force, basically, in slavery, and technology. Of course, as you say, the resistance means that, of course, only very, very low forms of technology can be used under conditions of slavery. Whereas with a working class, a technically free working class, obviously you can then move to basically an ideological control, and you can persuade much of the working class to buy into the system one way or another, and therefore you can use a much higher form of technology because you rely on the workforce to actually use the thing and develop it and not destroy it, as you would expect with a slave labour force, which would simply be interested in sabotage, which of course many people were, and you can see that actually is one of the prime movers of the Civil War in the US, that these two things couldn't coexist together. I do take Jackie's point in terms of the obviously the identification with the struggle against slavery by the cotton workers in Lancashire who to the point of almost starvation refused to handle cotton during the Civil War, and it's a tremendous example. I think that the other thing, of course, is racism as a means of control. And clearly, I mean, if you go, being in the States quite a lot, a chunk of my family are American, and you can see they've maintained racism, deliberately as a means of control and splitting the working class. It's not something that's sort of it's not casual, it's deliberately maintained by the system. And it's the same here, it's exactly the same. And you can see it, absolutely in Starmer as a product of that system. It is fundamentally a root and branch racist, because it relies on that. It relies on the fact it has to have it has to split the working class in whatever ways it can, whether that's racism or sexism or whatever else. And I think also, you also have the current thing, in terms of, the whole strategy of, say, Nixon, in terms of co-opting a section of the black population, as we have with Kamala Harris, for instance, and Obama and all these characters, as just, and worst of all, Ramaphosa, of course, who was a union official in South Africa and is now chiefly notorious for organising the massacre of miners at Marikana. Has become a billionaire as a result of that whole process. So yeah, say that briefly. Thanks.
Thank you. Going to bring in a couple of more comrades before Jackie comes in. Okay, there is Gabi.
Thank you.
We can hear you. Oh, good.
Okay. Just to cast, I just wanted to make a comment, carrying on from what Jackie was saying about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. As it so happens, I spent the afternoon with somebody who's a South African woman who's just done her PhD on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and what she did, because she is Sutu, and so she speaks the language, is interviewed people in Sutu about their experiences. And one of the things she discovered was that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission actually lied to people as they were being interviewed. They told them that as a result of what the TRC would do, or what we're doing, they would have houses with swimming pools. And one woman, the comment of one of the women was, they told me they would help me find the body of my son so that I could bury him in dignity and respect. That's a quote. I mean, it was in Sutu, and I don't speak Sutu, but it was translated by my friend into English. And of course, they never did any such thing. They never helped find the bodies of people who disappeared. And most of the people who were interviewed found that nothing that they had been told about the TRC actually came to pass.
Yeah, quite. Tina, you're...
Sorry, Kuala Lumpur, please. Hiya.
Hiya, thank you very much. I'm actually joining you from, I'm working in Juba in South Sudan, so I'm hoping that the internet will be able to hold. This has been really interesting, and I think for me, one of the things is the denial of what happened in Africa that continues even up to now, and really the denigration of our culture, and really almost treating African culture, African traditions as being inferior to European or Western culture. And this has continued even up to now, and is the basis of, you know, colonialism and what has come afterwards. This gets me really angry, and I really just want to find out, how can I direct my anger, my passion to something more meaningful? We've already seen the Black Lives Matter movement is already getting smears from everywhere, from the newspapers, from the media. And there's a systematic, almost a systematic attempt to really discredit the Black Lives Matters movements. So how can we organize ourselves as Black people? How can we organize ourselves as Africans to really address this this challenge that we have, and to really make a change? Thank you.
Can I respond to that?
Jackie, do you want to come in?
Yeah. You know, this is a life's work, isn't it? I mean, when I was in a children's home from the time I was 11. So not only did I come from a country where I had been taught that English history was my history, I then lost all real contact with even that part of my culture. And I then set myself the task of learning. And this is not easy. This is not an easy thing to do, but I think it's absolutely critical that Black people, wherever they are, become knowledgeable about the history that most affects them. And this self-work is not just self-work. It's important work, and it is work that you can then pass on and share with people you are with. Now, I would say that the thing that we need to do is, well, you know, it depends where you are and where your skills are and where your life is. But I would say to be active in some way in this mission, to insist on the right to speak up and speak out about Africanness and African history and the history of African people in terms of Euro-American society. So I would say that is your task. And it can be a little task. It can be, I need to learn this so I can talk to my own children, or it can be a really big task, you know. I think it's one of those, another one of those tasks that as Black people we need to do. I also think, by the way, that the left desperately needs to do this. I keep on saying this. I am astonished about the fact that with the left, they can tell you what Marx did in 18 whatever, what he had for lunch, who he was sleeping with, I don't know, whatever. Ask them anything about the involvement of Black people in the history, the economic, the social, political history, and there is a void. So I think it's a task that we all have.
Yep, you have to educate us, and that's what we're doing today. Lucy Scott, who will be joining us next week as our main speaker from the panel. Hello, Lucy.
Hi, good evening. Just to say thank you, Jackie. Like, that was so amazing and informative, and it's been a really interesting discussion. I think the main thing I was just gonna say, because it was just came back up in the chat. I've called myself DOS for a long time, similar background to Jackie, very disconnected from my roots, but, you know, found my way through, you know, particularly through reading the Communist Manifesto and actually seeing the system and finding my way into that history. But I don't any longer see myself as DOS, descendant of slave, because we were enslaved people. And I think it's important in our language that we acknowledge that, you know, Black people are not slaves. We were enslaved, and that kind of like whole tagline of slaves, and the way that history is taught and the way that we talk about slavery kind of denigrates us further. But the comment I just wanted to make was more so just hearing the general conversation. The African Holocaust, you know, Holocaust is a word that means something that is applied to us. I just feel that, you know, there is this legacy of slavery that, you know, was a genocide to our people, but there also is very much a continuing genocide. Genocide actually is part, it's not necessarily everybody part, but we're constantly, you know, at the brunt of disproportionate outcomes, you know, education, housing, the rest of it. But also, if we look at South Africa's research in biological warfare, if you look at the rates of infection of HIV in the prison systems during the Reagan era, there's a, you know, if we look at one size does not fit all as far as pharmaceuticals are concerned, the impact of ingredients on Black women, like there is an ongoing genocide of our people that is instigated to maintain the position of power and wealth that our labor created in the first place. So yeah, I came in with Jeremy. I didn't vote for Kia, but I'm here to, you know, call out Afrophobia, call out this Holocaust, defend the mess that has happened when, you know, all the mix up with the racisms and whose Holocaust is more important than the others all seems to get mixed up. Yeah, anyway, like, so that was what I wanted to offer, and I hope that people will see that calling African slaves is continuing to enslave us. We were kidnapped, tortured, and sold into enslavement.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well said, Lucy.
Thanks, Lucy. That's an interesting distinction. Jackie, we've got two more comrades who've spoken before, Tony and Jenny. I suggest we take them both, and then you can reply and sum up.
Okay.
Okay. All right, Tony, please.
Yeah. I mean, racism in British society came from colonialism, imperialism. And the reason why anti-Semitism was prioritized was because it wasn't derived from colonialism. In fact, there wasn't any anti-Semitism. When anti-Semitism was a very real factor, which was in the 1930s, and the Labour Party was nowhere to be seen. And similarly, in the 1920s, when Poel Zion, what is now the Jewish Labour movement, was recognized, it was recognized because it was a settler colonial movement then, because the Labour Party historically has always been a party of empire. It's a myth that the Labour Party was ever anti-colonial. That is simply not true. It believed it could make it work better But in fact, under Attlee, it made it more exploitative for the colonies. So we have to be clear. If I can just touch on the debates about the abolition of slavery. I mean, I think Jackie follows the thesis of Eric Williams, who was the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, capitalism and slavery, who did argue it was in capitalism's interest to abolish slavery. To be quite honest, I don't altogether buy that. Nor do I agree with Drescher, who says it was econicide. In other words, Britain committed economic suicide by abolishing slavery. Because although it may have been profitable to the plantation owners, it wasn't profitable to capitalism as a whole. In essence, capitalism needs a market. And slaves, by definition, are not paid wages, so they can't actually be consumers in any real sense. And I think it's inimical to capitalism to actually have slavery. And that is why Britain did actually send out naval patrols and stop, forcibly slave boats off the coast of Africa. It wasn't just a bluff. It was seriously committed to it because it's antithetical to market relations. I think in that you actually understand why capitalism abolished. It certainly wasn't because of Wilberforce and the Christian evangelicals, of course, but it was also not purely economical. I don't think we should be economistic about it. There was a political motive over and above the pure profits of that. On the third thing about Black Lives Matter, I just want to say this about whether it's political or not. It obviously is political, even if they don't recognize it. Yeah. But my fear is, and it is a real fear, is that Black Lives Matter will retreat into a form of identity politics, and it will abandon class politics. And I think that is really, really dangerous. We should be very clear. Racism does not derive from the nature of individuals. I mean, this is the whole ideology of Scarman, race awareness training and so on. You can solve racism by converting people to become anti-racist. In other words, it's got nothing to do with society. We have to be clear. We live in a racist society, and that is why people are racists, yes? But we also have to put forward to people, quite simply to workers, it's not in their interest to be racist. Racism undermines, racism gets the poor to fight amongst themselves and lets the rich off the hook. And we can overcome racism, whereas in settler colonial societies, it is impossible to convert the settler minority to an anti-racist position because they have such a material interest in that racism. That's not true in Britain, although there may be a material advantage. It is crumbs off the table, as Lenin put it. So I think we need to be clear analytically about these things.
I will go some way in agreeing with you, but I would also make some corrections. Racism actually was a product of slavery, not of colonialism. It really was. It really was. And this thing about naval boats intercepting the slaving ships, that was also about competing with the other European powers, So I mean, all of these things are obviously more complex than what I have said. But I think my point, I would still stand for my point, which was the reason that those things happened. The fundamental reasons, I'm not saying they weren't other rationales and other pressures, was an economic one. And the economics was, I actually don't agree with you that they needed a market. Slaves were a market in a way. Slaves were a market. They had to have things bought for them and provided for them. In fact, one of the complaints in Jamaica in emancipation from some slaves is that they were left destitute without any money to buy anything. So, but no, I think it was, if you look at what was happening with sugar and the price of sugar, the price of sugar was going down and it made it less and less economic. Anyway, we can have that discussion another time in the pub, Tony.
A pub? Socially distance.
Not going to the pub these days. Thank you very much, Jackie. Was that your summing up, or did you have anything?
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that. Can I just say, I think, just generally, I think what I enjoyed about that was the conversation. I think the conversation really brought out more interesting points. It's very hard because you often feel in a talk that you have to kind of lay a certain ground. but actually the really important issue is about the politics, and how that politics impacts upon us now. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much, Jackie. I think we've all learned a lot. Please.